Recently I put out a composition of mine, and someone was asking in the comments what types of chords I was using throughout the piece, and I was using borrowed chords. Then I thought this would actually be a really good video and it would directly answer this particular question. So this whole video is on borrowed chords and how to use them. Essentially what we're doing is we're taking chords from both the major key and the minor key. Let's start off by simply looking at the chords in a major key. If you've taken some theory classes or if you've watched some videos on YouTube, you may know about functional theory. So we're going to go ahead and cover that real quickly. These chords right here are your tonic functioning chords. That means they're basically the chords you end on. They're the chords that are the most strong, harmonically speaking. Then you have your predominant chords, and then your dominant chords, which gives you things like your final cadences and your big 5-1 progressions and all that mess. And yes, after I made this graph, I realized how insane it looks, but that's just how it is. Music theory is kind of insane. Now let's take a quick look at the chords in a minor key. All the functionality is the same for this as it would be for a major key. So when you're using borrowed chords, you're basically borrowing from what's called the parallel minor. You may have heard of the relative minor, which is something else, but basically the parallel minor is, if you're in the key of C, then you're taking the parallel minor would be C minor. Or for example, if you're in the key of D, the parallel minor would be D minor. You get the idea. So here's an example that shows you both major and minor chords with Roman numerals and the actual chord symbols underneath. What we can do from here is really interesting. Let's say you had a normal 1, 4, 6, 5, 1 chord progression, sounding something like this. So if we wanted to change that up and use borrow chords, we could, instead of going 1, 4, 6, 5, 1, or whatever, we could go 1, borrow the minor 4, then borrow the major flat 6, then still go to our 5. Commonly, you don't really use the minor 5 very often from the minor key. You generally are still going to use your major 5. But then from there, go back to our 1. So now we're borrowing from the parallel minor. Here's what that sounds like. There's a big difference in the sound, and you don't really have to think about it functionally. I mean, it's just good if everything still applies, all of those functional rules, but you can do some other things with it that are really interesting. Like, for example, in the piece I wrote, which I'll talk about some next week, called Man Song, I kind of do a lot of non-functional movement, but using parallel chords. Like, for example, going from the 1 to the flat 7 down to the flat 6, sounding like this. Another thing using borrowed chords is really good for is creating very heroic sounding music. Like, for example, in the main theme for Zelda games, it has a super heroic sort of sound to it. So listen to this, I'll circle the chords that they're using as they go. Okay, that last chord was something else, we'll talk about it later. But you saw how it was using all of those major chords and such, and it creates this super heroic sort of sound. It kind of seems counterintuitive, but when you're borrowing from the parallel minor, it opens up that opportunity to use nothing but major chords, and it still be kind of within the world of functional music. Adding to the topic of heroic sounding music using these chords, there's this one, it's actually a cadence. It's called the flat 6, flat 7 to 1 cadence. And it sounds like this. It sounds like you just beat a video game. It's great. Listen to this. It's super heroic, and you hear it all the time in like films and video games, but it's also very common in classical music. So that's a way you can end your piece. Instead of doing a big 5-1, you can do this big flat 6 to the flat 7 to the 1, and it sounds awesome. The last thing that needs to be addressed is what melodies you write over these chords, and like what scales you use, essentially. Got good news for you. Super duper easy. If you're playing a major chord, from the major, C major or whatever, you're playing that major scale. And if you're using a chord from the parallel minor, then you're playing in that minor scale. Super duper simple. So you can kind of experiment with that. And there's, of course, other things you can do if you want to get more creative with stuff. But that's essentially all there is to writing melodies over that. Thanks for watching, and I hope you found the video helpful. There's still plenty to learn on the topic of borrowed chords, so feel free to search around and experiment with it on your own, and let me know what you guys find.